Hi, I'm Joe Tucker, and I'm excited to be with you here today at the Grant-o-thon session on the approach. Today, I'm going to talk about the approach and go into more detail about this critical piece of an NIH grant application. And so a brief outline today, I'll talk a little bit about why the approach section is so important. I'll talk about some key components of the approach, and I'm not going to get into the entire thing. Dr. Hasinapour is joining us next week, and she'll cover the second half of the approach. Because this is such an important topic, we wanted to make sure it's covered really well and do it in 2 weeks instead of one. I'll talk a little bit about tables and figures as part of NIH grants. I'll go into videos briefly, and then I'll talk about sort of an NIH specific issue called sex as a biological variable, although actually it does apply to some other grant types as well. And this is meant to be participatory like our other sessions, so please feel free to put questions into the chat box. You'll notice that there's the Q&A box as usual, but there is also the chat box is open today, so excited to get feedback on several different bits and pieces of the presentation. After this presentation, the PDF will be available on the website as per usual, and the archived version of the video will also be available on the Grant-o-thon website. So I'm going to start with a question, and just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. What are the most important things to include in the approach section of an NIH grant? And please go ahead and write answers into the chat. You could also use the Q&A box, I suppose, if you wanted to. So go ahead and start writing. Ifoma is saying methods, and I completely agree. That's a really important part of this, like a more detailed methodology. And Angela is echoing methodological detail. Great, exactly. What else? Hypotheses, yes. Muslio is bringing up a really good point. In the aim section, we really want to be specific and think about what are the specific hypotheses and sort of questions that we're interested in answering. And Johanna is bringing up a really good point that the research team, and this is a little bit different. So you do have bio sketches in an NIH grant, and the bio sketch is a whole up to 5 pages specifically on each of the key personnel. But then separate from that, in the approach section, just like Johanna is mentioning, it's really helpful to have a description of the research team. And so usually this will be kind of a paragraph, and it'll say who's the PI, who are the co-investigators, who are the key team members. Clarabelle is also mentioned strategy, and I think that's important. Sort of what are different specific strategies or techniques that you will propose in the research study. Any other suggestions about alternative plans? Yes, and this is one of this is one of the trickiest and I think most important parts of an approach section. Dr. Hasinapour is going to get into this in more detail next week, but basically the alternative plans, you kind of preempt the reviewer and you say, all right, what's going to be a likely critique? And then you find a compelling way to either say, you're right, and we'll address this potential problem this way, or if we find X, then we'll do a different approach and we'll do something slightly different. So the alternative plans are really key. Maria mentioned sample size, and that's a really important part of an approach section. And there is an opportunity now for NIH grants to have a totally separate section on power calculation, data analysis plan. So usually in the approach section, you'll get sort of a paragraph or a summary, and then there's a separate section in the grant that'll go into greater detail. And Wenjie is bringing up a really good point, the conceptual framework. That's exactly right. So they want, the reviewers will want to see theory. And this is particularly important for qualitative studies or mixed method studies. It's really important to think, what's the overarching conceptual framework, theories, frameworks, models that you're going to be using throughout the study. And the study population, that's definitely needs to be very clear. And usually this would be very specific, and it would say, what are the study inclusion criteria? What are the study exclusion, who would not be eligible? Hong Yoon is bringing up a really good point about pilot results, preliminary data. And this is also something that is, you may remember from Dr. Miller's talk, some people like to put the preliminary data as its own kind of section. And I would say the more common strategy is to have preliminary data attached to each of the specific aims in the approach section. So as part of the approach, you would see preliminary data for specific aim 1, and then under your plan for specific aim 2, you'd see preliminary data for aim 2. And then I see Dr. Matthew Adu is saying this is where you introduce the topic, aim, and sample size, and that's exactly right. So you go back to your specific aims that you've introduced on the aims page. And then the other thing that's really important is that you do have a little more room in the approach if you want to make the aim a little more descriptive or longer, but I would be very careful about introducing new terms. In other words, you'll need to harmonize the aims that are on the aims page with the aims that are in the approach section. Reviewers can often get tripped up if you use one term in one place and a separate term in a different one. And I see Kenneth is mentioning the method of data collection and analysis, and that's spot on. That's definitely really important for a good approach section. Data collection and data analysis. There is, luckily for NIH grants, there's a whole separate section that allows you to go into more detail about the analysis plans. And Wei Ming is bringing up a really good point, outcome measures. So what are the primary outcomes? What are the secondary outcomes? And especially for a clinical trial, this needs to be very clear. You need to have a really strong justification for why you're choosing this as your primary outcome. And then after you define your primary outcomes, the sample size calculation needs to really tie into your preliminary data and say, all right, we expect this much of an effect based on our preliminary data. And then that leaves us with a sufficient sample size to make to be useful. And then there's also what the aim is. Shingle is saying what the aim is, what the expected results are, and how to go about it, methodology and logistics. And so I think this is the point about logistics and sort of how things get done is really important in plain language. That's a really key part of the approach section. In terms of expected results, I would reframe that a little bit. I would say hypotheses are really important, that you want to have hypothesis-driven science. But you don't need to go into great detail about, basically for each of your specific aims, having a very specific testable hypothesis is important, but you don't need to go into greater detail than that. So I think this is really helpful. Thanks everyone for putting your more detailed answers. And I'm gonna go to the next slide. So this is like a kind of mental tool that I find helpful. Think about your reviewer on a very crowded economy seat airplane. And they're looking at your grant and they're distracted, they're tired, they don't have enough caffeine, they're really just sort of annoyed and short attention span. This is the person that you need to be writing for. So you need to make things really clear in your approach section exactly how it's going to be, how the science is going to be organized. And the other point about this is it's okay to duplicate things or to emphasize things if you feel that this is a really key point, but I would be cautious about repeating things unnecessarily. If you have, for example, an aim 1 and an aim 2 that both rely on the same sort of premise or rationale, repeating exactly the same rationale wouldn't be necessary. And so you've really discussed in broad strokes what the approach section is all about. This is really where you're going to describe in detail what you're proposing, including preliminary data, the rationale, the analysis, and the sample size calculation. And it's similar to a method section of a research paper in terms of providing enough detail that you can actually do the work, and could be useful after your grant is funded as a protocol manuscript. And so you want that sort of enough detail that you could replicate the experiments, but at the same time, you need to make it as concise as possible. So if there's extraneous things or unnecessary words or concepts, weed those out. And there are 3 different ways to approach the approach section. There's a sequential approach if each aim has a different study populations or data. And so if your aim 1 is really looking at doing sort of mixed methods research in 1 or 2 cities, your aim 2 is a national level participatory event, your aim 3 is a global consensus project. Having a sequential approach in that case, because you have slightly different study populations and data, would make sense. And then you can also use an integrated approach if there's substantial overlap. So if this is really about a single randomized control trial, an integrated approach might be more appropriate. And then the third way to organize the approach section would be a hybrid that takes a sequential approach for different aspects, and then the integrated approach for other specific aims. I want to go back to the kind of reviewer on an airplane. Don't annoy your reviewers. You want to be friends with them. You want to kind of induce their enthusiasm and trust. So watch out for acronyms, and you just think about what percentage of your reviewers are going to be familiar with the acronyms and remember them over time. And so if 10 or 20% of your reviewers won't know the acronym beforehand and probably won't learn it for the paper, then I would suggest writing it out. And then repetition, we talked about before. It's good to repeat the specific aims before the approach section that's associated with each aim, but don't repeat items in the approach as a rule of thumb. And it's the other thing that you can do is to cross-reference other parts of the grant. So what are some of the key parts of an approach section? As Wenjia mentioned before, there's theory or a conceptual approach. And this is where you can really show that you know some of the important guiding literature, and it's also a way to demonstrate that you've done your homework or know the field. You don't necessarily need to pick one theory or approach. In many grants, it'll be a combination of 2 or 3 theories or frameworks or models, and you're bringing these together in a new way, specifically focused on this topic. So it can be a nice way to integrate a figure into the approach section of a grant. And then we talked before about study team and how this is a more concise, kind of distilled overview of the study team. And the study team section can show that you have complementarity. So you've got the biostatistician, you've got the qualitative researcher who's going to be doing your in-depth interviews. And the study team is also a place where, and I've seen this in more recent grant applications, you can actually put a photograph, a small photograph of key study personnel. And I think in some cases where lived experience is really important, having photographs could be a nice way to make the section stand out. In terms of your aims, the typical approach to organizing aims within the approach section, I first have an introduction and I kind of signpost and tell people, what is this aim about? And then I'll go from introduction is about a paragraph or so. I'll go into justification and feasibility. And this is where, this is not the data that I've published, but this is sort of framing the aim and saying, why is this topic so important? Why is this feasible? It's sort of a rationale, justification, and then preliminary data. The preliminary data section is really, what are the data that have come out of our group and related to this exact topic? And the preliminary data could be from a co-investigator, it could be from a consultant, but the preliminary data are going to be important, and especially for an R01 type mechanism. Once you get to the R01 level, you need to have very strong preliminary data. For other grants, such as like an R03, an R21, and R34, you don't need preliminary data. And then after preliminary data, you'll have the study design. And this gets into more detail about your study sites, why were these sites chosen, key steps. And for the sort of key steps, usually I'll have either a numbering scheme or an alphabetical kind of order, and then just go through kind of step by step, what are the key things that will happen during the research study. And then sample size and power, we talked a little bit about before. This is just a thumbnail version, a smaller version, and then the larger version of sample size and power calculations have their own separate section. Measures are also quite important, and this is where you'll say, we're going to be defining our primary outcome using this validated measure that's used before in this population, or we found a great measure that we're going to be adapting for use in this new geography. So measures, and oftentimes the measures will be set up as a table, and you'll state some of the key characteristics of each of the measures. And then data analysis, what are some of the key analyses that you're going to be doing? And I feel like this is also a place where you can, you have sort of your main idea and your main analyses, but you can also have room to specify some secondary analyses as well. Expected outcomes, we talked about potential problems and alternatives. Mina's going to talk a little bit about that later. And then a summary. At the very end of the approach section, I like to have a brief kind of paragraph summary. And it's also important to include sex as a biological variable, and we'll get to that in just a moment. And Alufemi, yes, the presentation slides will be available as a PDF file on the website, as well as the archived video. I'm just going to go to the next slide here. So theory, we've talked about this briefly, but reviewers like to see some kind of conceptual framework, theory or approach, and you need to think about how multiple theories kind of come together. This is really going to be very important in your qualitative studies as well as the mixed methods research. And for those who are interested, the University of Washington has a very helpful website on picking a theory, model, or framework. It's here, and oops, sorry. You can check it out. It's basically goes through many of the theories and frameworks that are commonly used in implementation science. Tables can help to break up the text and make things easier to emphasize. And you need to, don't forget to put a table title above the table. Make sure that it can be interpreted on its own. So footnotes underneath the table are helpful, but it really needs to be standalone. Using consistent fonts and sizes as the rest of the grant application. And the NIH does allow for different fonts. Arial 11 is probably the most common and kind of the default for NIH grant applications. They do allow, the NIH allows shading and colors. And my take on kind of shading and colors is that if you want to use colors, don't draw unnecessary attention to them. Make it the science on the page that just really excites people. You don't need to excite people based on the colors. It's really the science that needs to kind of jump off the page. And I realize why don't I just pause here for a moment? Any questions about tables or other parts that I've just discussed? And thanks, Yusha. She's put the website for the Grant-o-thon workshop into the chat box. And then the next component of the approach, figures. This is explaining new concepts, and figures can really help you get your point across. They need to be intelligible without the text. In a clinical trial, a flow chart can be really useful to kind of map out the territory. And this is analogous to a consort diagram in a trial paper. So starting at the top with your eligibility assessment, going down, randomizing what's going to happen in the different arms of the study. You may, as I mentioned before, you may want to consider small photographs of the study team members, and that could be particularly important if their identity is relevant or their lived experience is relevant to the grant application. And if you have a figure that you feel like doesn't really add value, then I would delete it. You want to be very concise. The other point about figures, you used to be able to have appendices for anything that sort of didn't fit, but then NIH grant researchers would use this to sort of circumvent page limits. And so they're a little bit stricter now with appendices. You can still put as an appendix an interview guide or a survey instrument or something along those lines. But you need to be careful about extending the application beyond the page limits. Videos. A video can actually provide valuable information, not in the grant itself. You would need to write about it in your cover letter that you're submitting a video, and then include an image or a still of the video in the research strategy. And again, you want to assume that not all the readers would access the video. So don't have, if there's sort of key preliminary data, I wouldn't only put it in the video. It would be useful to close caption to increase understanding. And then after your review group is listed, you could contact the scientific review officer. And unfortunately, they don't allow hyperlinks to videos. You can still put URLs into the reference section, but like actual hyperlinks, it's discouraged. And if you have a question, feel free to put your questions into the chat box. I see someone's raised their hand, but go ahead and write it into the chat box, and I'm happy to. And Catherine's asking, can you share an example of how you can use a video? The NIH does have a, it has a, there's an example, or there's more information about using videos, but it is an example from our research. We have created like 1.5, 2-minute videos that are more for a public audience that introduce our pay it forward research. And so you can see like what the clinics look like and how it works. And it's basically, in some ways, it's more for a public audience rather than a purely scientific one. But I think a video like that can help the reader. If you have a new concept, and in our case, like pay it forward, this is sort of a new idea, just having the reader to completely understand how the idea works could be useful. So in our research, embedding a video like that into a grant application, I think would be really quite useful. Other ways that videos could be useful, if you had like a result, or if there was a video within the result that was like preliminary data that was particularly important, that would be another way to sort of integrate video into your grant application. Sex is a biological variable. So sex is a biological classification encoded in DNA. Gender is a separate issue. It's really a social construction. It's about roles, behaviors, and expression of men, women, and gender diverse people. There's a nice video from the NIH that explains SABV, and this is actually something. SABV is the acronym sex as a biological variable. You need to think about this. So at the stage of recruitment, if you're only focusing on men, why are you excluding women and other genders? And if you're at the stage of data analysis, similarly, could you do a sub-analysis that differentiates based on sex? This is a really important section, and within the approach, it's basically a requirement. So like when reviewers look at an NIH grant, they will specifically look for a sex as a biological variable and see that it's explained. So this is really, it's an important issue. So, all right, true or false? Cost is a valid reason for excluding females in a research study. And write your answer in the chat or in the Q&A box. False, says Yusuf. False, says Yusha. Clarabelle, yeah, you guys are right. It's false. And I think this is really important from an NIH perspective. Cost is really not an acceptable reason to exclude females from a study. There are scientifically justifiable reasons to exclude women. And to give an example from our research, if you had a grant that was focused on men who have sex with men, this study is focusing on this subgroup because of HIV burden, because of STI risk. And so it can certainly be scientifically justifiable to exclude females, but this needs to be explicit and it needs to be included in the approach section. So thanks to our team, and you can see the photo here, especially Yusha, who's been fabulous to help put all of these bits and pieces together. Like we mentioned before, this will be, the PDF will be on the website, and the archived video, or the video will be archived on the website as well. And I'm going to go to the Q&A. Any final questions before we move on? And I know that we didn't get to everything in approach today, but that was sort of by design. Dr. Hasinapour next week is going to carry forward the other bits and pieces of approach. But any clarifying questions or things that people would like to discuss? I see one question about, to measure outcomes, how will one address the query of how do we look at validated tools to measure outcomes? If validation is not part of the specific aims, is there a way to include questionnaire validation as part of the objective? And that's a great question. So if a specific measure has not been validated, you could adapt a question or a survey item for the purposes of your research study. If you wanted to develop a whole new survey or domain of a survey, I think that would be fair game within the scope or within scope of an NIH study. Just validating it, I think it could be part of a larger research study. So I would say it's definitely possible. And then, would you recommend a special explanation when the variable race is used? And you're bringing up a really good point about NIH nomenclature on race, ethnicity. In the US, the terminology tends to be race/ethnicity, and there is a special section of NIH grants where you state, are you recruiting underrepresented ethnic minorities or other underrepresented groups? And it's basically thinking about inclusion. So there's a section on inclusion across the lifespan that's thinking about age. There's a section about inclusion of women. There's a section about inclusion of racial and ethnic minority groups. So it's definitely an important point. Thanks for flagging that, Laura. Ifoma is asking about, is sex as a biological variable only relevant for studies that are looking specifically at men or women? So sex as a biological variable is something that every NIH grant needs to address, even if it's only men or if it's only women. In some ways, it's even more important when you're only looking at one group or the other, because you're excluding, a group or at least one gender, and having a strong justification for that would be important. Any other final questions? No? Great. Well, thank you very much. We will be back at the same time a week from today. It will be 1 p.m. UK time, and Dr. Hasinapour will finish up with specific aims. And thanks everyone for listening today. Have a great day.